Making a custom tree is no simple task, but that's all about to change. In this video, I'll be showing you 5 things to consider when building a custom tree that will take your trees to the next level. Most custom tree tutorials walk you through building a very specific custom tree, but I don't want to do that. I want to give you a general process that you can apply to any custom tree you can imagine. So to start with that general process, I mostly mean planning. In my opinion, making a good custom tree starts with having a precise idea of how it's going to turn out. Don't just jump in and expect it to look good, rather consider the palette, scale, trunk type, tree shape, and leaf placement. Now let me explain what I mean by each of those. Starting with palette, you're going to want to decide what wood and leaves you'll be using depending on your surroundings. I may not want to make a spruce tree in a desert or an oak tree in a snowy biome, but obviously that is your creative choice. Now with that out of the way, what I mostly want to talk about with palette is the actual blocks you're using, because using oak logs with oak leaves for an oak tree is kinda boring. Instead, look at this oak trunk. I use stripped spruce logs and even mud to add some variation. For birch, I use diorite, and if you want some extra color, also stripped birch logs. Then for spruce, I use stripped dark oak and even brown terracotta. These blocks look great with dark oak trees as well. Quick note, I use dark oak fences with spruce trees instead of spruce, and spruce fences for oak trees instead of oak. They're just much closer to the color of the log than the actual wood type. Now before we talk about leaves, here are the palettes for acacia, jungle, mangrove, and cherry blossom trees because I did not forget about them. But to actually get to those leaves, you don't have to do this, but if you want to, you can use multiple different kinds of leaves per tree. Here in this oak tree you see I have birch leaves at the bottom and oak leaves at the top, almost creating a gradient. Again, here with this birch tree, I use not just birch and oak, but also acacia leaves. And yes, in case you're wondering, acacia leaves will take on the same shade as oak leaves. Take a look at the following images. Oak, acacia, jungle, and mangrove leaves will change their hue depending on the biome, while spruce, birch, azalea, and cherry leaves will maintain their base color. Keep this in mind when choosing both the leaves you want to use and the type of tree you want to build. But with that said, I think I've emphasized the difference palette makes when building your tree. So let's move on to step 2, scale. Now I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about scale because it's pretty straightforward, but the main thing to keep in mind is that the size of your trunk will determine the scale of your tree. The trunks of these trees are small, so the tree itself is also small, but if we step back to look at these two trees, we notice that they are much bigger and so are their trunks. This is what I'd probably consider to be the normal size for a custom tree. And then there's this guy over here. He's obviously much bigger because his trunk is much thicker. And now he may not be super tall, but if we fly up to the top here, we notice the circumference of the leaves is much bigger than the circumference of these other trees. So keeping that in mind, the general thing to remember with scale is don't do this and don't do this. It just makes your tree feel very unproportional and off-balanced. Now before we move on, there is one more thing I want to talk about, and that has to do with this large tree over here. If you noticed earlier, I used more blocks than I showed for the oak palette, and that is because I like to add more contrast in a larger tree than I might in a smaller tree. I absolutely love the pop of color mud and mangrove adds, and if we fly over here, I also like to use moss and mossy cobblestone, especially for a birch tree. And yes folks, we are now done talking about scale, but I actually want to take a closer look at this birch tree in order to tell you about the next thing, trunk type. Let's go ahead and de-leaf this tree to take a closer look at the actual branches. Although there's a lot of branches going in all different directions, these are the main two I want you to look at. Notice that instead of going straight up, the trunk splits out sideways into these two branches. In nature, this is called a tree fork, but we are ignoring nature, so we're calling it a split trunk. Now in comparison, let's look at this tree. So first of all, we're going to de-leaf it like the other one, and now we can look at the branches. This trunk goes all the way straight up through the tree, and the rest of the branches stem off from that one. I call this a central trunk. So when I'm deciding whether I'm going to be building a split trunk or a central trunk, I like to keep a couple things in mind. The main thing is what type of tree you're building. For most trees like birch or oak, I feel fine building either a split trunk or a central trunk. But when it comes to spruce, I don't think I'm going to be very accurate if I attempt a split trunk, so just stick with central. I also think that a central trunk is simpler, especially if you're new to making custom trees. With the central trunk, you can really add branches anywhere off of that main trunk, and if you haven't noticed, I kind of scatter my branches everywhere. What is she doing? Anyhow, the last thing I would consider when choosing which trunk type to build with is regarding tree shape. Depending on the shape you're going for, you may be more inclined to build one trunk or another. But with that said, we have yet to actually talk about tree shape, which is indeed our next thing. Now before we start, I want to make a clear distinction. When I say tree shape, I'm not saying that this tree right here is tall and vertical. I'm saying the shape of the leaves is round, and this tree is horizontal. But having established that this tree is round, let's go ahead and rob him and chuck him over here. These are our three main tree shapes: round, horizontal, and vertical. Now of course you can have other shapes such as this triangular acacia tree or this cherry blossom tree, which really doesn't take any particular shape. But when considering what shape to make your tree, you should really look at the reference pictures of that type of tree. While birds I can see being round, vertical, or horizontal, most of the other trees don't vary as much. Oak can definitely be both round and horizontal, maybe vertical if you really want, but you cannot really make a spruce tree that isn't vertical if you're trying to be accurate. Same with acacia. You really only see horizontal acacia trees. For the rest of them, I'll display some images on screen, but I highly recommend looking at your own references as well. Now, there's not really much else to talk about with shape, as it's a pretty simple topic, but the last thing I want to mention is a lot more complicated. Leaf placement. While this is probably the most complex concept of the video, it's also the most important one. When I say leaf placement, I'm talking about the techniques of placing your leaves, which, let's be honest, is what's going to make or break your tree. But before I explain further, I'm going to need to give you some context. When I was scouring the internet to expand my custom tree knowledge, I realized something. Many tutorials put an emphasis on the location of the branches, which is something I had never really done. So I kept researching. And this is when I found Exilis Tree Map, and loading up the world I had an epiphany. There's a whole style of custom trees that I had never dabbled in prior to this video. Look at this tree. The leaves are very clearly concentrated around the branches, and while this may seem like the obvious way to build a custom tree, I argue there's another method. Let's look back at these two trees I showed earlier. I would say that they look very different from each other in terms of style, and that is because I went about them in an entirely different way. Taking away the leaves, you were probably wondering what in the world is going on with this guy on the left. Like I said before, I like to scatter my branches everywhere. But with this one, it's a lot more structured and the branches are placed more intentionally. Let me introduce to you shape format versus branch format. I'm going to try and explain this in the simplest way I can think of because it's kind of tricky. Shape format, you go from leaves to the branch, and branch format, you go from branch to the leaves. Branch format is what we were looking at in Exilis map in the style most tutorials emulate. This format creates a magnificent shell of a tree with a carefully crafted trunk and branches. Once one is happy with the locations of the branches, all they have to do is add leaves around them. Shape format is this chaotic mess, which I personally think can also be quite a thing of beauty. This format focuses on placing the leaves in such a way that creates a certain shape of the tree. If you know what shape you want your tree to be, you probably know where you want the leaves to go. For example, I'm building this tree here and I wanted to have a horizontal shape but to where it's kind of diagonal. In order to complete that look, I'm going to add branches here, here, and here, even if the placement is kind of messy or illogical. Covered with leaves, this is the final result and I really like it, especially with the lanterns at night. Also, one more thing to note before we move on, I tend to use a lot of fences to help place leaves in certain areas. So if you're doing a shape format tree, that's my tip for you, but if you hate fences, maybe don't do that. Shape format has always been the style I've been most comfortable with building, but you should experiment for yourself. If you're trying branch format and can't figure out how in the world to place branches in an aesthetic way, then try shape format. But if shape format is way too chaotic and messy for you, then try branch format. You can also use a mix of both. For this large tree, I'd initially built branches in specific places, and then noticed this empty space, so I added another branch to fill that area. But with that said, we are finally done talking about leaf placement. The only last miscellaneous thing I have to advise is keep your leaf to air ratio 40 to 60%, otherwise your tree is going to feel very crowded. But that is going to wrap it up for the 5 things to consider when building a custom tree. In recap, think about the palette, scale, trunk type, tree shape, and leaf placement. But also remember that this is your creative project, not mine, and my concepts of tree building could be completely wrong in your eyes, and that's fine. You can ignore some of the things I've said, or just take bits and pieces to fit your own unique preferences. Anyway, I really hope you've gotten something valuable out of this video, and if not, let me know in the comments too. I'm not going to pretend to know everything, and if you think I missed something, let me know. But if you've gotten this far, thank you so much. I really appreciate it as I put a lot of time and effort into this video. If you enjoyed, subscribe. Now, I hope you have an amazing day.